You should put it outside for the birds, you know. Anything left over, like when it falls out, you know. Like we did it with the dogs. We comb them, and then we just throw it, and the birds come and gather it for their nests. So, but she does have a bit of a bald spot. Just probably from laying down. No, you're not old. Just tired. Yeah.
It's kind of easier to sit there with a good turn of it better. That's exactly what it's doing.
I like how this light is shining on my bald spot here. It's just glowing in this picture. It's quite nice.
Could you use a signal for help if we got stranded in the mountains?
All I have to do is like.
Where's the code with it?
Yeah, exactly. S.
Your receding hairline.
Exactly. Shine a light.
Do you have any notes?
Danny should have handed them all out.
Oh, you got one here.
Okay. And there's one on the table there as well.
I didn't know.
I made 10 up. So 4, 6. Yeah, there should be lots for everybody. All right. Good evening, everybody. And if you're with us online, good evening to you as well. I'm just going to straighten that out. Have you ever taken an animal's head in your hands and looked in their eyes and think, I wish I could figure out what you're thinking. Like, I would love to know what's going on inside your little head. And anybody, especially if, I'm sure even cows, you've probably wondered, what is going on inside your head? And it would be I don't think we'll... Yeah, in that case, that big head, yeah, that giant skull. Yeah, and it would be very curious. I doubt we'll ever get to that point where we'll actually be able to figure out what's inside an animal's head. But, well, how much more so if you looked at a fellow human and grabbed their head and go, I wish I knew what was going on inside your head. As I observe both species, and that we're very different, animals function purely out of necessity. When they're hungry, they eat. When they're tired, they sleep. When they're angry, they respond. They don't delay. Like an animal doesn't go, I don't think I'll eat today. I'm just going to take. They automatically react out of driven. It's only humans that can act above our nature. So even if we're hungry, we can say, well, I'm not going to eat today. I'm going to fast or respond. Or if we're angry, we should be able to actually control our emotion. We can actually elevate ourselves above just the sheer base physical nature that an animal cannot do. I don't think they have that ability. And I think that's in part because of obviously how we're designed by God. But it goes to show you that how much we think and what we believe governs our actions. Where an animal is not governed by their belief. They are simply governed by their necessity. So we can say, I believe that not eating today is important. I'm going to fast. So that belief that it has a spiritual impact, or perhaps for a medical reason. So our belief can override our baser nature. And that's why it's so critical about what we believe. If we go through Jesus' teachings in the Gospels, especially in John, repeatedly he says, believe, believe. And the proverb says, as a man believes in his heart, so he is. So what happens then when we get, we'll start with the positive. What happens when we believe the right thing? Things go well. We connect with reality, right? We can be safer if we believe that speeding. If I believe that Dylan loves me, that will change my worldview, right? So things go well when we believe the truth. I was listening to a podcast. They were talking about what's killing humans. The guy said, which kills more people, sugar or fentanyl? And the instinct is want to say fentanyl, but the answer is, of course, white sugar, right? He says, but we don't believe. So all these things. What happens if we believe the wrong thing? We can harm ourselves. Disaster can happen to it. And so it's absolutely crucial. So I want to give you an example tonight as we move into Galatians, because Galatians is a story, in this section in particular, about Peter's failure to believe the truth and the harm that it caused the church and the potential harm that would have caused for generations up to us today. So I want to begin with a very sharp illustration. You have a little, looks like a little newsprint heading with a picture of a man with a very 1970s mustache there. This is from United Press International. I want to read you the whole article. You just got the first. This is from Warsaw, Indiana, May 2nd, 1982. I'll read you the whole article, and you just have a little clip of it there. At least 52 people have died for lack of medical care because they or their parents belonged to a fundamentalist church that insisted only faith in God will heal them. But a coroner said Monday the church is beyond the reach of state law, which was fascinating. The 52 victims are linked with Faith Assembly, a 10-year-old church based in Wilmot, Indiana, and headed by Robert Hobart Freeman. That's Hobart Freeman in the picture. It has about 2,000 members. The deaths occurred in 7 states, were reported by the Fort Wayne News Sentinel, a copyright story. The newspaper said that most of the 52 people who have died while refusing medical treatment were women and children, including babies, and only a fraction were old enough to understand the teachings of the church. But Kosciuszko County Coroner Gary Eastland said state and local officials have been thwarted in efforts to deal with the sect because of state laws allowing parents to withhold treatment from their children if they act in accord with religious beliefs. We may not like it, but what can we do, said Eastland, whose jurisdiction ends at the county lines just miles from Faith Assembly's headquarters in Wilmot, Indiana. Eastland said that many of the 2,000 members in the church who worship in a rural building known as the Glory Barn are highly educated people who abandoned decent occupations to join Freeman's sect. They're people who we kind of grew up with, he said. They look and act kind of like they are in a trance some of the time. I think they're brainwashed. Local officials hope a new state law that goes into effect in June 1st will allow police and welfare workers to step in. And then he just goes on to talk about some of the state laws. And I'll just, it is said the 52 dead, including 28 babies, whose mothers shunned doctors during the pregnancy. 7 children were treated with untreated illness and injuries ranging from chickenpox to pneumonia to cancer and burns. 10 adults who suffered from untreated illnesses ranging from diabetes to kidney disease, and 7 mothers with complications related to home births. To verify the count, and they just give the details of this and how they're prosecuting. Freeman, the church leader, is a biblical scholar who tells his followers he doesn't expect to die and that those who turn from his teachings will go to hell. God has promised that the prayer of the faith shall heal the sick, Freeman has written. He did not qualify this by adding sometimes, nor did he say that the prayer of faith shall heal only some kind of diseases. By the time Freeman died, it was up to 72 or close to 80 had died. And one of the things they would do is if a baby had died, they would put it next to a living baby on the altar in hopes that the life force from the living baby would flow into the body of the dead baby. So ultimately, Freeman died of infection because he had an untreated wound, and he just didn't take any antibiotics and died. So there's kind of one of the classic cases, and strangely, this is the late 70s, early 80s. No, this isn't the 1800s or something, right? So it's a case of what happens when theology goes astray. And we believe in healing. And there is a picture on our fourfold gospel. We pray for healing, and that is never going to stop us. But Freeman took it to that extreme. Turn to Galatians 2. This is a case of Peter the potential of damage that Peter could have done to the church, while Freeman's actions resulted in the deaths of dozens of individuals. Had Peter's course stayed and Paul not corrected him, the church as we know it today would not exist. So you think of the billions of lives that would have been affected had Peter's path continued and Paul not confronted him. So we're going to read the first 11 verses. Danny, you want to read, let's say, 1 to 6 and Joyce 5 to 11 of Galatians chapter 2.
14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to the revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you.
As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do.
All right. Anything jump off the page as you read that?
The conviction of, we didn't give it into them for a second.
Yeah. Paul's very determined. All right, this is the second crisis within the early church. The first crisis is when Peter meets Cornelius, and he has to make that decision, and they decide, what do we do with the Gentiles? How much of the law is required? Does anybody remember in Acts 15 what handful of laws the Gentiles were to remember?
No meat, no.
Yeah, don't eat meat offered to idols.
And there was no fooling around with family members.
No fool around with it. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
no kissing cousins.
Yeah. Don't eat anything with blood in it. So it's a small handful. We said that the Judaizers were asked to give up 609 laws or whatever, and the Gentiles were asked to keep like 4 or 5. So now the second crisis comes as Paul has encountered Christ on the road to Damascus, and he's now preaching to the Gentiles. And the same question we have been asking for weeks or months now is, how do you deal with your traditions? How do you, today at Squirrely Shirts, when Michael was there, we were talking about his Chinese cultural backgrounds. How do you connect? How much do you bring into the faith? What influences you? And what do you allow to navigate within? And I think those of us who have different backgrounds, whether it's a liberal background, who said, well, I could, like there was a legendary story about this gangster in Vegas who had come to Christ and he was still being a gangster. And, a while later, the guy said, you realize, he said, well, nobody told me I couldn't do that. He was just a gangster for Jesus. It was like, oh, okay, that maybe a little point of correction there you needed. So he kind of brought his liberal background in. Others bring an arch-conservative background in. And so Paul comes now, and he's preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. And he's concerned. What's he concerned about here?
That what he had preached was not right.
Yeah, he says, I was afraid that I had run in vain, that what I was doing. So this is Paul's foundation of his testimony. We'll see how it all integrates into Galatians in a few moments. So the first thing he gives is his conversion story. We see that in Galatians chapter 1. Then we see he talks about his time in Arabia. Then he talks about his visit to Jerusalem. This is all chapter 1. And now we find him in going back to the church in Galatia. And he brings with him a couple of people. Who does he bring with him? And Barnabas. Good. Barnabas was a Levite. He's a good Jewish boy from Cyprus, and his name means Joseph. Why is he called Barnabas? Because they changed his name for him. They called him a son of encouragement. So that's his nickname, basically. Leaders full of nicknames,
But they usually get shorter.
they get shorter and funnier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a lady today, and her son, she said, "Oh, that's so and so." He goes, "Oh, come on, Mom, what's his real name?" And there was a guy named Fuzzy, and she said, "I don't know. All I know him is as Fuzzy. I don't know his real name." So this is his nickname, and he is the first person to embrace Paul at his conversion. We see this in Acts chapter 11, and he's a leader in the church of Jerusalem, again in Acts chapter 11, as was Silas there. So we know he is a major influence in the life of the church, as he is the one who encounters Paul and basically vets Paul's transformation, his conversion story. So he goes to Tarsus, he searches out Paul, and helps him with the work in Antioch. So he's a missionary companion. He is a Jew of noble character, respected in the church. So who does Paul bring with him to the church? One of their respected own. But he also brings Titus. Now, Titus is not Jewish at all. He is a full-blown Gentile, not a half-Gentile like Timothy. He is, and he's one of Paul's helpers, especially in tough places like Corinth and Crete. And what does the church require of Titus to follow along? In the passage we just read. Yeah, they don't, right? They don't even require him to be circumcised, right? Even though he's a minister of the gospel, he's working closely with Paul and Barnabas. So what's Paul saying? That when I came, he didn't even have to do that, right? He says, we had freedom. It's interesting. Sir William Ramsay speculates that Titus is Luke's brother, but there's no evidence, but it's kind of a cool little side thought. So why is Paul going to Jerusalem? Well, what's motivating him to go? Take a look at that passage.
There was some problems.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, the Judaizers were seeking out to kind of destroy our freedom, to bring in the law. And so they're telling Paul, look, you just can't go tell these Gentiles to come to Jesus and all's fine. You got to keep the law. At the very least, they got to be circumcised. They got to follow the law. They got to do this. So take a look at verse 4. What does Paul call his gospel? The freedom. He says, this is the gospel of liberty, right? Liberty, liberty. That's a U.S. insurance company, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so this is the gospel of freedom. And Paul is concerned about what? The false brethren are going to come in and add laws. How many times in our life has the law of freedom been proclaimed, and then somebody comes along and says, yes, but. And they want to add to it, right? So what is the outcome of the meeting? Remember the poor. Interesting, hey? It's the first council in Jerusalem. They say, don't eat meat offered to idols, don't fool around with your cousin. And now they've taken all 613 laws and brought it down to one law, which Paul says, hey, already doing that, so no problem. So they don't change the gospel of freedom.
You were praying one night and he said, listen to God, and maybe God will tell you what he wants you to do. Well, if God told me to go outside and ride my bike, I would do it. What do you think of that? He told me to do that, and that's the very thing I was eager to do.
That's very eager. Yeah, I was eager to go ride my bike.
God told me to go outside and ride my bike, I would do it.
It's like Brian Hayes when there was a Brad with the license, when he was trying to get his license, and he had failed, and he wanted it really bad, and he says, well, maybe today God will help you. He says, or you'll get it soon, and he says, well, I hope God knows it's today.
That's good.
I hope God realizes it. That's great. What's at risk here? Let me ask you, rephrase that. What would have happened to the gospel proclaimed for the last 2,000 years had the Judaizers won the day?
Wouldn't have been good.
Okay, it wouldn't have been good. How would the gospel have changed?
It wouldn't be salvation by faith.
Exactly.
It would be back where the Jews were.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The whole message of the good news would have changed completely. Because it would have been, come to Jesus, have your sins forgiven, and you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. What happens when someone says, you have to keep the laws? What does that do to our brain?
You can't tell me what to do, and therefore now I want to
Yeah, there's pushback, right? Yeah. So if also the law says, oh, and don't forget you can't eat meat with blood in it. You're going, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, right? The rarer the better. I want this steak to be at such a point that a good vet can revive it. Right away, and then it adds, and also then it becomes something we do. You go, okay, I've kept the law, therefore I'm righteous. Anytime we add law, and the speculative question is, would Christianity be the faith we have today had they won the day? Most likely not. Who knows what would have happened to it?
Freedom, you don't have the freedom.
Absolutely, yeah.
First of all, right?
Yeah. The good news wouldn't have been good news. It would have been good news plus. Especially, we're not just talking about the outcome of salvation. This is in order to be saved. Now, we recognize that the outcome of salvation is obedience, and there is certain behaviors that are required. You let him who steals steal no longer. You don't have the freedom to steal or be a gangster. But it's this entrance point is freedom. The righteousness that we reckon ourselves that the victory of Christ is my victory. The freedom of Christ is my freedom. The joy of Christ is my joy. Not by works of righteousness which we have done. All these, right? Had it been anything else, it would have been a different gospel altogether. So that's what's at stake. The very essence of the gospel of freedom and the human nature of rebellion all tossed in here. So this is a huge issue. So the Church of Jerusalem recognizes Paul, sends him on his way. All right. Let's take a look at what does this teach us about, first off, about Paul's character. She'll never get fed that way, Ethan. No. What does this teach us about Paul's character?
Well, he was determined.
Yeah. Like Dylan said, nothing's going to get in our way. So he's a very determined individual. Good. What else? Okay.
Confrontational.
He is willing to be confrontational. Yeah. But notice also he says that I went up because I was what?
He was worried too that he might have had.
Exactly. Then after 4 changes, it says, if you look at verse 2, it says, for fear that somehow I might have been running or had run in vain.
Yeah.
There's a moment he goes,
Fear.
I just want to make sure I'm not wrong. What kind of person is willing to say I might be wrong? Humble. Teachable. Yeah, exactly. There's not an arrogance to Paul. He does say, I was afraid I could have been wrong. So I wanted to get the confirmation. Not that those men meant anything. He calls them, he kind of puts them in their place. He doesn't elevate them. But he does seek confirmation. So we see him as a willing, to some degree, a team player. He's confrontational, but he is also teachable at the same time, which is remarkable. He's humble, for I fear that I might run in the race in vain. Anything else that tells us about his character in this first opening conflict? Does he go up by himself?
No, he needs to be with them.
Right. Why?
He's fair.
He's
He
fair.
takes a Gentile and a Jewish.
Yeah. He allows both voices to be present with him. Yeah. He has 2 witnesses that come with him, so he's not going up to defend this gospel alone. Barnabas, who was was Jewish, defends his gospel of freedom, and Titus, who is extremely liberal, also defends his gospel of freedom. So he takes these parallel people and brings them, and they both say, yes. It'd be like an arch conservative and my gangster character, both coming and saying, freedom is the gospel of freedom. So it's interesting how he pulls 2 very unique people from different sides of the coin, and they line up right with and again, it's not his gospel, with the gospel he's proclaiming. Okay. What do you think? Now, Don and I and Christina were talking about this at supper about questioning people's motives. Motives are often subterranean, but let's speculate with a bit of the sacred imagination. What do you think motivated Paul? Yeah, exactly. I found freedom, and I don't want anybody else to be encumbered again.
From a whole different way of life, too.
Absolutely.
Convergent, big time.
Yeah. He wants the purity of the gospel, right? He wants to get this gospel right, because if you get the gospel right, what happens to the rest of life? Life is right. If we get the gospel wrong, if we get Jesus wrong, everything's going to fall apart from there on in, right? And so he's motivated by the purity of the gospel and the community that he's proclaiming it to. He doesn't want to proclaim a false gospel to the Gentiles for fear that he will have run in vain. So I think his motive and his heart are very, very good. All right. So this is the first confrontation with the truth. Paul is, I don't want to say uncertain, but he does use the word fear. And he is humble, he's confrontational, but he's willing to work and listen to them. And he said, and in the end he says, and I was right. I don't think there's an arrogance in him here. The only thing, remember the poor, the very thing I was all. All right, now the tide changes. Because now we get Peter. Donna, could you read verses 11 through 14 for us?
But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?
Good. All right, you've got a couple of maps there just to help you put things in context. So in one map, there's a black blob in the middle. Now, that area that's in the map, you'll see kind of a dark gray, that's the Mediterranean Sea. And this is obviously Israel and Egypt. You'll see that the edge of the Nile there. And this is modern-day Turkey, the big white area. Well, what the Romans did was they took Turkey and they divided it up into provinces, just like Canada is divided up into provinces. And that black blob in the middle is the province of Galatia. So the book of Galatians is the book of Saskatchewan. It's written to a province and all the churches within that province. So that's where Galatia is. But if you look at this other little larger map here, you will see down here at the bottom of the arrow pointing to the south, it points to Jerusalem. And if you follow the arrow all the way top, you see the city of Antioch. So that's where Paul is going to and talking about when he talks about Antioch. They're not terribly far apart. And Antioch is the place where they were first called Christians. So you get that. All right, so now we have a conflict. Okay, anything jump off the table for you when you read or when you listen to what Donna read for us, and then when you read it yourself?
Well, he's pretty strong feelings about Cephas.
He is a man with strong feelings, yes, particularly in this case. Yeah. What's the issue the second time around? Hypocrisy, yeah. That becomes the problem. The issue is similar, right? Where the law. So prior to the coming of certain Judaizers, how's Peter living? Like a Gentile. He's free. He's eating with the Gentiles. He's probably having a ham sandwich. He's doing his thing, right? He's just enjoying. I had some Jewish friends in Garden City, and they said what there is there's a kosher zone for 50 miles outside the synagogue. And past that, because they had a cabin up at Lake Winnipeg, and they liked bacon at breakfast. So they were out of the kosher zone, right? So why is Peter acting in freedom? Because God told him to. Way back in the book of Acts, right? With Cornelius. Go, eat whatever comes down from the blanket. So what's Peter doing? He's living the freedom of the gospel, which Paul just talked about early on. And he's living in that fullness of the freedom that came from the gospel, that was revealed to him. Then a party of the Jews, just like we see in the early portion of this passage, had come down and they were saying, no, you have to keep the law. You can't do certain things. And what does Peter do? He caves, he switches sides. And how bad is it? Who's influenced? And Paul says, even Barnabas. How dare he? Barnabas, my brother. Barnabas, the pillar of the church. Even Barnabas was swayed. Why was Barnabas swayed? Because of Peter. And who's Peter? He's Peter. That's right. He's the pillar of the church. And Barnabas is going, so if Peter does this, I guess I should be doing this too. And poor Barnabas is now becoming enslaved once again. So this is the second set of conflicts, and this is the root of the conflict later on in Galatia. So Peter's error, take a look at verse 12. For prior to the coming of some of the Jews, from James, some men from James, who used to eat with the Gentiles, and when they came, he began to withdraw. Notice not completely, he's doing it slowly, fearing those of the circumcision, and the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy. Why is it hypocrisy?
Because you believe one thing and do another.
Exactly. Because you were told you believe in freedom, but you're not. So the first phrase is interesting. It states that Peter ate regularly prior to that. And the second and third stress that there was a reduction in social context. He was slowly withdrawing. Peter hadn't crossed the line completely, but he is starts to come across the line. So if you look at verse 14, Paul now, in Pauline fashion, says, when I saw they were not straightforward with the truth. I love this man. About the gospel. And what is the truth of the gospel? Freedom. The freedom from the law. I said to Peter. It's interesting. In the translation, what's that?
In the presence of all.
Yeah, it's actually Cephas, he calls him. He goes back to his old name. He says, you're acting like...
His full name.
Yeah, exactly. You're acting like Cephas again, not like Peter. And yeah, in the presence of all. Why in the presence of all?
They all needed to hear it.
What's that?
They all needed to hear it.
That's right, because they were all being influenced, right? Because the toxin of Peter's hypocrisy had flowed to all. So if he had just talked to Peter, Peter might have changed his mind, and they would have, maybe not. So he has to talk to where the problem is. So if there's a problem in church that affects all the church, does this sound like Matthew 18? If there's a problem just between individuals, we deal with it. But if there's a problem that has spread into the entire church, then you have to confront the entire church, because you don't know how far this influence has been. So I came straightforward about the truth of God. I said to see, if you, being a Jew, lived past tense like Gentiles, why? Because of Acts, he learned how to do that, and not like the Jews, how is it that you now make the Gentiles live like the Jews? This church problem had to be dealt with publicly because of what? This conflict had affected the entire church in Antioch and ultimately had it. All right, let's take a look. This is the great battle, Paul versus Peter. You have a terrible picture. This is about the closest we can get to actually what Peter and Paul looked like, but this is from the 4th century. So this painting is about 350 years after the date. So I'm trying to think, what was 350 years ago? 1600? Yeah, so it's like a painting of someone from the close enough. And they have big bulgy eyes. So and so we have Peter or Petrus, and then we have Paulus in this little 4th century. All right. What's the conflict in Jerusalem? What was it about? What was the tension there? The first one. What was at stake? No. The first. Paul says, I'm afraid that I might have been wrong. Exactly. So Paul says, what is the gospel? Right? So for Paul, that section is a theological discussion. What is the nature of it? Goes to Jerusalem, says, let's talk about what the gospel is. Is it freedom? So it's almost more intellectual. What's the conflict in Antioch? It's not about theology anymore. Now, it's about practice, right? It's about the outcome of theology. And so where Paul is gently wrestling in Jerusalem with the leadership there, now when it comes to the outcome, how do you live in the light of the gospel, especially if the gospel has been perverted? So now he's confronting...
He also said it was clearly in the wrong, whereas beginning Paul was just like, I might have been, and I'm worried that I might have been, but now this is clear.
That's a very good observation, Joyce. Yeah. One was a degree of uncertainty.
Yeah.
This is a certainty. Yeah. Why was he so certain?
We can see it.
Right. Because he had just established it in the first conflict. The first conflict solved it, gave the gospel a certainty. This is the gospel. So the first issue in the first section here clarifies the gospel. So Paul has every confidence now. He can go in and say, I think this is the gospel. Barnabas, what was his name? Barnabas, yeah, Barnabas. Barnabas thinks it's the gospel. Titus thinks it's the gospel. The church in Jerusalem says this is the gospel. He has every confidence from the body of Christ. But with Peter, he goes, you are messing up. So let's compare their strategies with this issue. Paul goes directly to Jerusalem. He's proactive. He brought along his allies, went before his seeming adversaries. He does it in private. He's humble and self-aware, yet not willing to compromise. And he makes, what's the one accommodation he makes? Take care of the poor. So he's willing to make a reasonable accommodation. With Peter, very different. In the face of opposition, Peter compromised. Peter lacks whatever, courage perhaps. And he went from eating with Gentiles to separating himself. And there Paul says, I opposed him. Face. Isn't that a great image? Some of the translations go that Paul uses this language. Some say because he stood condemned, because he was to be blamed, because he stood self-condemned, or the TEV says because he was clearly wrong. And the New Jerusalem Bible says since he was manifestly wrong. Why does Paul change his style between the Jerusalem conflict and the Antiochian conflict?
It was a different problem.
Yeah, different problem. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the clarity of it, right? Because Peter is so clearly wrong. Yeah. Paul recognizes that Peter's behavior is going to damage the gospel. And as Ethan said, Peter should have known better. What Peter was saying was grace for salvation, but law for life. And he was bringing law or shifting it. Now, it's interesting what happens to Peter. Turn into two passages. Shelley, could you look up 2 Peter 3:18? And Dylan, if you could look up 1 Peter 3:6. Let's see how Peter would respond. Remember, 1 Peter and 2 Peter were written 13 years after this conflict. 2 Peter 3:18 and Dylan, 1 Peter 3:6. Second Peter 3:18.
Second Peter.
3:18.
All right. 3:18. For Christ died for sins once for all, and the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit.
2 Peter.
2 Peter 3:18.
No, First Peter.
It's funny, but I had that one highlighted in mine too.
Yeah, it was
Good verse, Shelley. Good verse. 2 Peter 3:18.
Yeah, I kind of not find it. But grow in the grace? Is that,
Yep.
Okay, but grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him be glory both now and forever. Amen.
So how is Peter different in 2 Peter than he was at Antioch?
Grace.
Grow in grace. Please. What has Peter just been done? He grew in. How did Peter grow in grace and knowledge? Through rebuke. We often think of growing grace and knowledge as a very gentle, grow in grace. Peter grew the hard way. Peter's story is the story of a guy who grew the hard way. He gets confronted, he fails, he falls down, and then Paul has to confront him, but he's always growing in grace, but it was a rebuke that caused him. All right, Dylan, 1 Peter 3:6.
Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear.
Why does Peter cave in the first section?
Fear.
Because he was afraid of, he says, because he feared the Judaizers. Later on he says, but you are right if you don't be frightened by any fear. Has Peter grown? I sure hope so. Yeah. He overcomes, he's given courage. This rebuke is good for Peter, because 13 years later we see him grow in grace and knowledge. Don't be afraid. Very often people will talk about, either say nothing about the issues that they wrestle with, or they'll talk about them all the time. Right? Peter is not afraid to talk about fear, because the man knew fear. All right. Just a little sidebar, how does this fit in Galatians? The false teachers were challenging Paul's message, so Paul asserts that his gospel is greater than any authority, even Peter's, and Peter is not the head of the whole church, nor is he superior to the gospel. It's interesting. Peter is viewed as the head of the church in Jerusalem, but how does Paul view Peter? Just another guy. So the church that says Peter is the head of the church, Paul goes, no, he's not. Interesting statement. All right. The false teachers in Galatia were stating that Paul was not an apostle. Here he shows that not only is he an apostle, he is the one who reprimanded the chief apostle, Peter. All right, let's compare the two styles of these people. Paul has two styles in dealing with conflict. Within the Jerusalem context, when the issue appears unsettled, he is humble. He goes in private, and he's willing to wrestle with that. When the issue is settled, how does he deal with conflict? Directly. So if we're not certain, if we're not settled, there's nothing wrong with going, what do you think? Help me out here. I'm not, do I understand this right? But once we've got the conviction of the truth, what should we be?
Straight to the point.
Straight to the point. Courageous, right? This issue, and very often people will wrestle with an issue, then they'll get the courage of their convictions. Now, you don't have to be belligerent or cruel to it, but that once the issue is settled, he is far more direct. He is self-aware, he's willing to listen, and he's willing to make a reasonable accommodation and care for the poor. We also know...
Clarity and boldness.
That's right, once there's conviction. I also want you to notice that Paul never condemns Peter's personhood. He condemns his actions. He doesn't say, you're no apostle, how dare you? He calls him a hypocrite, and he confronts him, but he never demeans Peter. Now, Peter also had two different styles when it came to conflict, unfortunately. On one hand, when he's with the Gentiles, how does he behave?
Like a chameleon.
He says, I'll eat a bacon sandwich. And then these Judaizers from James come, and he changes his style very quickly because he's afraid. Why was Peter afraid?
He has become all things to all men.
I know. Yeah, we'll get to that point later. It's curious that Peter would be afraid. Here's a man who has seen the risen Christ, who has, he stood up on the day of Pentecost. 5,000 were saved. He's seen miracles. He's seen the risen. And yet these little group come from James, and right away he's frightened. He's a fascinating character because we have this radical boldness and courage and miraculous. Peter's going along and miracles come, just the shadow of his coat, and people are being healed, right? And yet a handful of people come and he's frightened right away. Fascinating character. He's unsettled and uncertain, and he's vulnerable to the opinions of others and the pressure of others. Fear threatened Peter's freedom, just as fear threatens the freedom of the gospel. Martin Luther wrote this: Peter did not say so, but by his example said quite plainly that the observance of the law must be added to faith in Christ if men are to be saved. For Peter's example, the Gentiles could not help but draw the conclusion that law was necessary unto salvation. Peter withdrew from social pressure, not theological reasons. He separated himself. He was making accommodation. Now, was Peter a man who handled difficult spots well? No, we don't. He doesn't have a good track record, right? We see him, a little girl says, aren't you the one? And, he runs. So he's had a tough run of things. What would have happened had Peter's quote-unquote gospel gone forth and Paul not corrected him? Bad things. Good. What was that risk here? Truth, exactly. The gospel would have been transformed into a form of legalism, and we would have not been able to eat bacon at our men's breakfast. I think had Peter not been corrected in this moment, the church in Antioch, which is the mother church for the Gentiles, right? It's the first place they're called Christians. It's where the gospel will spread to the Gentiles, would have been so changed that it wouldn't be the gospel we know today. I think this would have been the end of the gospel as we know it today. So this little moment is transformative.
But God would never have allowed
And that's right. I mean, he didn't.
that. But he had to.
Because Paul got in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Banked him over.
J.C. Ryrie says, there are three great lessons from Antioch, which I think we ought to learn. First, the lesson is that the great ministers may make great mistakes. There's a comfort in that. The second is that to keep the truth of Christ in his church, it is even more important than to keep peace. Keeping the truth is more important than keeping the peace. The third is this: there is no doctrine about which we ought to so be protective as justification by faith without the deeds of the law. All right, what was the issue? I'm going to read from the Amplified because it picks this up so clearly, where Paul says to Peter, If since you, though born a Jew, can live as you have been living, like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how do you dare now to urge and practically force the Gentiles to comply with ritual Judaism and live like the Jews? If you as a Jew live as Gentiles like you were doing before, how can you turn around and ask the Gentiles to live as Jews when it comes to issues of the law? All right. What is the big deal about not eating together? Joni, could you turn to 1 Corinthians 5:11?
Can I read it?
Please.
But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people.
Good. This is a practice the church picked up over the years. So if someone is falling out of faith or has sinned, what's the first thing you stop doing? You don't eat with them. You break fellowship. You don't eat together. We were witness to a church in Alberta that once a year they got together and everybody stood, the elders, they went through your life. They went through your finances, your giving, your behavior. They would call in witnesses. How is your life lived? And if they passed muster, you did good, you got to have communion that year. If you didn't pass muster, guess what?
Could this have been Mennonite church?
This was, I won't say the name, that you were not allowed to have fellowship with anybody. And that meant, particularly, you couldn't have communion, eat, and no one could eat with you. So they would literally go to restaurants, sit at two separate tables, put one tablecloth over top, but there would be an inch gap between the tables. Therefore, I'm not eating with you because we're out of fellowship because you haven't passed muster this year, right? And then they would have communion that first Sunday, and all the non-successful people would stand at the back of the church, and all the successful people would come forward and have communion. Like, you talk about divisive.
Like, there needs to be accountability, there's no question, but that's
Absolutely.
not how you do it.
No, that's right. Yeah, this is a totally different. But this whole idea was, I can't eat with you anymore.
But and the thing is, who can judge? That's right. Is it-
Well, the elders apparently, so, yeah.
Like, really? Are they
Yeah.
so perfect?
Well, and that'd be there. They had to be prejudged first. So the question is, what meals are they talking about that, Peter was telling them they couldn't eat? There is some speculation that they were talking about communion here. And that Peter was saying to the Gentiles, look, we can't have communion with you anymore because you're not following the law. So this may have been more than lunch. Peter may have been refusing to have communion with the Gentiles. In other words, this could have been division at the Lord's table, potentially. That's just speculation.
Talking with my brother-in-law about this months ago, and he was saying, like there's certain people because of certain situations within family and stuff like that, like there's such hard divides. Like the stuff with my dad, for example, he says, your dad is not somebody we would have over for a meal.
Yeah.
The way things are, we would not eat together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Meals are something you do with people that you are on good standings with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, and I had just thought about that day, and I said, okay, well, James has thought about this. It was interesting conversation.
Yeah.
He says, eating meals together with people, that is something you do with people you're on good standings.
It's significant, isn't it?
Well, it's very symbolic of a lot of things in Scripture.
Sure.
Meals are centralized around a lot of rejoicing and worshiping.
Absolutely. And that's where, you think of all the metaphors that of the final gathering is a meal. The bride of the wearing, the meal of the lamb, the who will come to this banquet. He goes out.
Feast.
Yeah, the feast. And the very first thing Jesus does is a wedding feast. The last thing he does with his disciples is a meal. That food is, what do we learn from Judaism? What's central? Food. Food, music, and dancing and partying, right? But food is central, and everything is remembered through food. How do you meet with God? A drink offering. What do you offer? A lamb.
But what a good, check and balance. It's like, you're not good to me. I'm not feeding you.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll be good.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll be good.
Yeah. If you're not my
That would
friend,
straighten me out.
if you're not my friend, we can't have supper together.
That's right.
I guess it begs, is there a person you'd say, I don't think I could sit across the table from them and share food with them?
It's an interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
I haven't gone deep into it, but.
Yeah, and that's
But
where,
it's not, it's like the same idea of inside the church you deal with people a certain way, and outside of the church you deal with them with love and grace and warmth.
That's right.
Inside, if there's problems in the church, that's very different. We don't just go, oh, it's okay, you
Right.
can sin a little. Well, it's okay for the people outside, but they don't know God.
yeah, the standards are
You-
different.
The standards are
Yeah,
different.
absolutely. And that's where Peter, that's why Paul corrects Peter.
Right.
He says, the standard for you is, for the Jews outside the fellowship, they don't eat with Gentiles, that's fine.
Yeah,
But
because
for
who
you-
he was, what he said he believed, and what he represented, and what he stood.
Especially Peter, who was so high, so highly regarded. And Peter's influence to the point of Barnabas. That's why Paul draws that, and even Barnabas was swayed, and the other Jews. Peter had failed to grasp the application of the gospel. Now, here's the question. Was Paul being hypocritical?
Paul.
Because Paul said, to the Jew I become a Jew, to the Gentiles I become a Gentile. So had Paul been hanging around with Jews, would he have refused to eat with the Gentiles?
But he wasn't a compromiser, he was an accommodator.
Yeah, and that's right. Very good, yeah. I don't think Paul was being hypocritical.
He didn't do it out of fear, he did it
No,
out of
exactly.
love, out of consideration.
Yeah,
Not
for the-
for himself, but for others.
So you got to wonder, though, when Paul was with Jews, did he eat kosher? Again, speculation. Most likely. He wouldn't have brought ham to a Jewish potluck. And when he was with Gentiles, he would have eaten meat offered to idols, so as to not offend.
When in Rome.
When in Rome. That's that little phrase, it comes from, there was a monk in Egypt, and he says to his father's brother, his superior, he says, here in Egypt we worship on the seventh day, on Saturday. In Rome, they worship on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. What should I do? And the bishop famously said, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And that's healthy accommodation. All right, how does this all end? Well, first thing we know, the gospel is preserved. Had it ended wrong, the gospel would have been lost. Harlan, you got your Bible there? Let's read. We're going to jump back to Galatians chapter 1, verse 9. What does Paul think of Peter? Galatians chapter 1, verse 9.
I will say it again, if anyone preaches any other gospel than the one you're welcome, let God curse on you and fall upon him.
Let him be cursed, yep.
Yes. Man, I got the verse wrong then.
Well, but that's the thing, he was preaching the gospel other than, like.
Yes,
he was
yes.
being hypocritical.
Yeah, I'm just thinking what Paul thinks. Oh, sorry, it's 2:9, not 1:9, 2:9. That makes more sense.
It worked.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah, thank you for shoehorning that in. But do you find it, Harlan? Chapter 2, verse 9.
God gave us each of special gifts, and they shook hands with Barnabas and encouraged us to keep right on with preaching to the Gentiles, while they condemned their work with the Jews.
Right. I'm still. Anyhow, what is? Oh, sorry, Harlan. That's me, not you. What does Paul call Peter in that opening section? He calls him repeatedly a. Go back. It's right in the opening section. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's in 2:9. And recognize the grace that had been given to me, James, even to who were reputed pillars. So, what does Paul call Peter? A pillar. So, what is Paul's opinion? Remember, this is written much after the event. Yeah. What is Paul's opinion of Peter? Very high. He's a pillar of the church. He acknowledges him, right? So, despite their dispute, despite Peter's betrayal and failure, Paul still holds Peter in high regard. He is a pillar of the church. What did Peter think of Paul? All right. Let's get this. Hopefully, get this right. Ethan. 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16. And Elena, 1 Peter 5, 12 and 13. 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16. And then 1 Peter 5, 12 and 13.
And count the patience of the Lord
So, and 16?
No, it's not. As he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters, there are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures.
Good. So what does Peter think of Paul?
Peter thinks Paul's patience.
Good. But he holds him in high regard, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Paul, our beloved
Brother.
brother. So he loves him, even though this is written, again, Peter's written, almost 2 decades after this event.
Which verse was that?
What's that?
That was 16
Second
or
Peter?
15.
That's 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16. What does he think about Paul's words?
Their scripture.
They're scripture. Yes, you know that from Miller. That he regards Paul's, he says, as they do other scriptures. So Peter is putting the writings of Paul on the same plane as other scripture. So Peter has very high regard for Paul. But he also thinks one more thing. He says, and he's difficult to understand. Good. Elena, 1 Peter 5, 12 and 13.
Our faithful brother, as I consider him, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God in which we stand. She who is in Babylon, elect better than you, so does my concern.
Good. So what 2 names does he mention?
Silvanus and Mark.
And guess who those people are? They are good friends of Paul's. So Peter and Paul shared a friendship circle. So despite their differences, what do we know about their relationship in the end?
Pretty strong.
It was pretty strong. Paul held Peter in high regard. He's a pillar of the church. Peter held Paul in high regard.
They loved each other.
They loved it, despite disagreeing. What is the one thing that Galatians doesn't tell us, or doesn't tell us about this conflict in particular?
That it changed the way they felt.
Yeah. And it doesn't tell us how Peter responded. Paul says, and I confronted him to his face. You being a Jew, how dare you live like a Gentile, and you help make you Jews. And what does Peter say?
But
Nada.
he
We
must
don't
have
have.
received it with some measure of humility, because if he hadn't, he wouldn't see that change in growth. We talked about grace
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
all those things. So he obviously
Yep.
had enough humility to accept Paul's rebuke.
And that's why later on he says, grow in grace. That's why later on he says, but it would be nice to have, we said, and Peter said, yes, Paul, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry.
But I'm willing to bet Peter probably knew he had this weakness.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
There's something about a rooster crowing a couple of times. It's not the first time he's said
Yep, that's
that.
right. He's failed. Oh, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
He probably knows himself well enough to go, how did I do this again?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's self-awareness by this point. Yeah.
But maybe he was quite ashamed at the time, so it took him those 10 or 20 years or whatever to grow.
Yeah, had to work it out. Yeah. And in the immediacy, and I think let's speculate, had he responded very negatively, Paul protects Peter's character by not including the account, perhaps, of a negative response. And also, at this point, he's proved his point. He doesn't need to add any more details because he's running out of paper, maybe. I don't know. But he doesn't need to. He's proved his point. Yeah. I'm running out of papyri here.
Well, it's like Paul came up with which would have been funny.
Yes. Hey, Peter. And so I crowed in his face directly.
Chuck him a chicken.
Yeah. The only other piece of little historical information that bears to this story is that Peter died in Rome between 54 and 58 AD, 64 and 68. 64 and 68. And Paul died in Rome between 64 and 66. So they might have been in Rome in 64, 65 together. They might have died at a similar time. They might, anything at this point is speculation. They might have been in prison together, but they both died around the same period. So we know historically they were both in Rome at the same time. So it'd be interesting to think, that this is now like in Hallmark territory. Now we have these old friends now who've had conflict and been missionaries. Paul has headed up the Gentile church. Peter has headed up the Jewish church. They've had years of ministry. They meet in Rome, 2 old men, withered and worn. Now they're in their cells together, ending their lives together. and the day, and legend has it, of course legends are legend, that they were killed on the same day. You know, so we can visualize this just for the sheer joy of it.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful, yeah. They go out together into the Colosseum. You know, Peter is crucified upside down. Paul is crucified. You know, Paul's head is cut off because he's a Roman. He's not crucified. So we don't know, but all we know is from history, bang, that they were there. They could easily have been there. All right, what do we take away as we wrap this up? The early church began with serious growing pains. What is the gospel? Who's it for? How do we reconcile the past with the present? Who did Jesus die for? How do we live this out? And what do we do with all 4,000 years of Jewish history? The second thing we learn is that leadership was not perfect. Peter, the pillar of the church, erred in ways that potentially could have hurt the gospel for centuries to come, and that Paul, when he was confident, was abrupt and direct, and I don't want to say saved the gospel, but turned the course, the tide of history to the point we have. But none of the gospel, as Joyce said, God wouldn't let it happen. The gospel was not defeated, not corrupted. And that's why today, when people speak and they corrupt the gospel, we have the right to get angry. You know, we watch these videos and we go, you have just corrupted the gospel. You've either added something or taken away. You have corrupted. That's when we as believers have every ground to be a little forceful.
Well, and I really do believe in those situations that God works through the faithful who stand up in truth and in boldness in those situations.
Yeah.
And God wouldn't let it happen, but he used his faithful.
That's right. And how did God not let it happen? He used Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there has to be those who are courageous and bold enough to defend the truth.
Yeah, and willing to stand up against that. Yeah, good. All right, that is Galatians 2. That is the two conflicts. Paul and Peter, and the rescue, not salvation, but the rescue of the gospel through courage.